Welcome to the pod, gents.
Hey, Jax.
G'day, Jackie.
Well, this is exciting. We've got some actual policy on the table that we can discuss. James, I want to start with you. What was the story that you guys broke this week and why is it significant?
Well, I mean, first of all, to your point, hallelujah, some chunky, meaty policy to discuss. What did it say? So essentially it said the Albanese government has asked Treasury for some modelling to see what the impact would be of winding back restrictions on placing restrictions on the use of negative gearing so that it might be limited to one property only or two properties only or perhaps even three properties only. We know that Bill Shorten took a different policy but in the same space in 2016 and 19 to limit negative gearing to new homes. Labor lost those elections. There's two very opposed schools of thought on whether that helped or hindered Labor. But to come back to the story of this week, Labor would is getting the modelling done, looking at that. They'd grandfather the policy. And I guess politically, I mean, it's not so much a tax policy as a housing policy that would raise a bit of revenue. What it would do politically, were they to go ahead with it, is potentially send that message to voters, particularly the under 40s, who think, how the heck am I ever going to get in a house? Saying, we hear you. We're taking steps to wind back some of those tax breaks for property investors. Yeah,
and I want to get into that later, just how the times have changed politically from 2016 and 2019 when similar policies were brought up by Labor and everything. The debate has evolved a lot, I think, since then in favour of people who want to do something about housing affordability. But, David, back to first principle, just very quickly, can you explain what negative gearing is and how it interacts with capital gains tax concessions for investors?
Well, let's make the attempt. And it's probably a good thing to try and start by saying what it's not. A lot of people think it's just this massive tax break that everybody with an investment property gets. But it's not that. A lot of people have investment properties but do not get negative gearing. You can have income from an investment property and you'll pay tax on that income. That's not negative gearing. Negative gearing is when you are losing money on the property. The interest bill is so big and the rental is so low and the other costs are so great that you lose money and you claim that as a loss against your other income. So it becomes a tax deduction that lowers your tax bill. Yep. It's a definite tax concession. It's helpful to property investors, but not all of them use it. Say there's 2.2 million people who own investment properties. About half of them may be negative gearing. Others are paying tax on their income. But the other thing they're all getting over time is a concessional rate of capital gains tax. And that's actually a bigger kind of sacrifice of federal revenue. It costs more on the budget. The fact that they will pay only half the capital gains tax when they sell those investment properties. Yeah. And so when people talk about negative gearing, often it becomes shorthand for talking about that whole range of things that operate with investment housing. Yep. And that's why I think it becomes more than just an arid policy debate. It's now got a huge symbolic power in Australian politics. And that's why after James started our discussion about this the other day and then we wrote the story together, we found an explosion in reader commentary and feedback about this because so many people regard it as an unfair benefit that others get and they can't get. Yeah. And that's why it's such a touchstone in politics.
Yeah, I think we forget as well that negative gearing, these tax concessions are available for other investments, but it just so happens that in Australia we've absolutely used them to turbocharge property investment, which has turbocharged the housing market and skewed it towards mum and dad investors and people renting, I suppose, from those mum and dad investors. A lot of economists say that changes to these tax concessions will only make a marginal, a few percentage point difference in housing prices overall. But as you say, they're almost like a symbol for levers that the federal government can pull to make things a bit easier for particularly the younger generation. James, I just want to ask you a little bit about the background to this story. I think it's very confusing for ordinary people when they read a story like yours this week, which is, a genuine scoop, and then they hear the Prime Minister on the radio this week saying, no, we're not considering changes to negative gearing. What's going on? Is this a story that the government's happy to have out there and have discussed a little bit? or is it something that they didn't want out there yet? What's the sort of background to it without revealing your sources, obviously?
Yeah, look, so no, sometimes, you do see in newspapers, TV, radio, what we'd call sort of drops or authorised leaks of information ahead of time to prepare the ground on a policy announcement. This was not one of those. I'm pretty sure the government wasn't ready to talk about this yet. Perhaps you can gather that a bit judging by the PM's demeanour in some of the many, many interviews that he's had to do over the last few days. When the PM says we're not considering this, he's being a bit cute, I think. Considering, can have a particular meaning in the sense of, right, we've, got the modelling on this policy, we've had a cabinet submission drafted, and indeed he said, it hasn't gone to cabinet, we didn't suggest that, but you have the cabinet submission drafted. We're now going into a cabinet meeting to consider the implications and options and ideas and to make a decision. So we're not at that stage yet. We as David and I have not suggested that they're at that stage yet. They're doing the preliminary work. So in that sense, the timing was all wrong. The other thing I think that's been quite interesting to see, Jackie, is that kind of, it's not our policy, it's not in our current housing policy. Someone sort of leaked me the talking points this morning that the backbenchers are supposed to use, and it's all like, we're not considering it, or we're not doing it yet, or whatever, form of dissembling words there are.
Yeah.
But again, we're not at that stage yet, and it's not our policy until such time as it is our policy, which is what we saw happen with the stage 3 tax cuts, of course.
David, we've just talked very briefly about the last elections, the previous elections where Labor has brought this policy or a variation of this policy to the electorate. 2016, as James said, they picked up seats. They did really well under Shorten. 2019, they were expected to win, and of course they lost to Scott Morrison in the election. That was a miracle. What do you think about the changing political environment for this policy? Are we in a completely different space now in 2024 than we were in 2019? Some people are even saying that the next election is going to be about housing affordability. That is the issue.
Oh, I think that's right. I mean, I think that housing is going to be an absolutely huge issue at the coming election, and both sides have to work harder on housing policy in order to put something compelling to voters. And I think there's a phrase that I've been thinking about using occasionally. There's an engagement deficit with federal politics at the moment. Voters are disengaged because they can't see compelling ideas from either side on issues that matter so much, like housing. So whoever wins and overcomes that engagement deficit is in very good position at the election. I think that's why the argument does change on negative gearing. It's got to be in the mix when anybody looks at housing policy. However, I still think that it's as risky now as it was back then, because even though there's growing frustration about negative gearing among those who can't get into the housing market, steadily there are more and more people over time who use it. And so by my calculations, there's about 15,000 people on average in every electorate who have an investment property. They might not have used negative gearing last year. They might have made income rather than a net loss. They might want to use negative gearing one day. And so it becomes a very risky thing for the government to do. Now, we didn't do the story this week because we had any source who was trying to shoot this down or kind of front-run the government. The story didn't appear out of any malice from a source who was trying to get Jim Chalmers or cause trouble for Anthony Albanese. It was kind of rare in that sense. We heard something, we checked it out, and wrote the story as soon as we knew it.
Yep.
So I don't think we're at the point where there are games being played inside the government to get this policy up or to tear it down.
Yep.
It's simply the fact that as Labor considers housing policy plans before the election, which clearly they've got to do in Treasury, this becomes part of the policy mix, and it's a logical part of the policy mix.
Yeah.
Just one quick point to pick up, just to bounce off rather what David just said about the engagement deficit. Labor so far in this term of Parliament, Jackie, has promised something like $32 billion in housing measures. Did you know that? Did I know that? Does anyone know that? They have not done the greatest job of explaining this to people. The negative gearing policy change, were they to make it, would perhaps raise $2 or $3 billion in tax revenue. Not a huge amount.
Which
They've
is
done
not
a lot
huge
more already,
in terms of the federal
budget. But it's
budget,
a totemic issue. People hear negative gearing and they think, it's shorthand for, are you on our side?
Yeah.
Are you trying to fix this?
And surely,
that's why it matters.
I mean, they might end up doing a middle road kind of thing because, as David says, a lot of sort of middle income, ordinary people do take advantage of this tax break, but maybe they don't take advantage of it for 32 properties, or as I read one headline this morning, maybe they could do it for one or two, and beyond that, people will be like, after that, you don't get the tax break anymore.
Won't someone think of the people with 32 properties?
Yeah, I know, wouldn't that be nice? You need a good accountant too. James, I want to ask you about the likely counterattack or negative campaign that we might see if Labor does take something along these lines to the next election. It needs something to take to the next election. It needs a bold idea. And as you say, this is a totemic idea. What kind of attack lines will we see from the coalition and the lobby groups?
Yeah, so say, for example, the sort of property councils of this world will be, well, in fact, they already are warning about the potential impact on the supply of new houses. That's not an unreasonable thing to say because property investors, when they do scale up to that larger figure, they do invest in, apartment blocks or multiple houses in an estate or whatever. If that money's not there or if it's slightly less lucrative to do that, it could affect supply. So that's not a completely ridiculous argument. The coalition already, we see Angus Taylor, Jane Hume, the government's lying to you, the government's not telling you this.
But
the
they're
government
not
needs to come
actually
clean.
Sorry to interrupt, but they're not actually ruling out the policy itself or looking at the policy itself, are there? Like, there does seem to be some bipartisan support for doing something about these tax concessions.
Yeah, look, I think there's a generational divide within the parties. I mean, we had David and I in a story that was 8 Labor MPs speaking on the record saying we need to be looking at this. But we also had Bridget Archer, and I'm aware of at least one other federal Liberal MP who also wants the party to be looking at negative gearing. There is an understanding, and it does run along those age lines where if you anywhere sort of near the age of 40 or younger, you get it, right?
Yeah.
The other thing we've seen from Angus Taylor in particular is framing this as an attack on mum and dad investors, right? And I think there's a bit of a scare campaign element there because from what we understand, this would not affect people with 1 or 2, potentially 2, negatively geared properties, and those are the mums and dads investors. This is used by policemen and nurses and what have you, and they wouldn't be affected by this, or at least as we understand it, they wouldn't be affected by it.
Yeah, and there might also be a grandfathering arrangement too. I mean, and the other thing that I don't know if we've talked about is couldn't you just give the tax breaks for new builds? So if you're building a new house and adding to supply, you get the tax break, but if you're buying a house that already exists, you don't.
Yeah, and the attack line from the coalition becomes, this is a war on aspiration, that you're dudding people who want to save for their future. Battlers will use negative gearing to try and build up an asset that they use for their retirement, things like that. And so it does become, takes on that greater symbolic value. But I also think that advocates for negative gearing change can somehow empower the scare campaign against any reform, because when you look at what the Greens say about this, they say the tax breaks are worth $176 billion over a decade. That's true if you put in every aspect of negative gearing and the capital gains tax discount, and you end up with a truly mammoth number over a decade. But nobody's proposing to scrap all of those tax concessions. But when you end up with $176 billion over a decade, that can become a very big scare campaign that a Labor government wants to slug you $176 billion. Yeah, and
it all adds to the sort of narrative that Labor doesn't have any ideas to grow the economy, they just want to tax you more. You mentioned the Greens there, David. The Greens leader, Adam Bandt, is already claiming victory for this policy or, possible policy. He's saying it's pressure from the Greens on the issue of housing affordability that's forced Labor to reconsider these tax perks. He kind of has a point, doesn't he, James?
I'm going to go way out on a limb and say that Anthony Albanese and Labor would strongly disagree with that, Jackie.
No, of course they would, but they're never going to admit it. But they are under enormous amounts of pressure from the Greens, who have led the political agenda on this issue, whether or not you agree with the policies they have to address it.
Yeah, no, it's indisputable that they've been pushing for action on this. Labor walked away from these changes in 2021 when Anthony Albanese was opposition leader. They're now back on the agenda. Well, if they ever went away, they're now back on the agenda in a fulsome way, and part of that is because of the pressure from the Greens.
Yep.
I think Albanese needs to reach for, more broadly at the next election. He needs to define himself in the minds of voters, and this is the sort of policy that could potentially give him the opportunity to do that.
Yeah. David, where are the opposition in all of this? Because as we've heard, they are talking more about the weasel words or the foxing that Anthony Albanese is using around this issue, saying he's not being upfront with the Australian people. They're less sort of quick to castigate the actual policy itself. Do they have any plans for housing affordability or for housing supply? We know that they have a plan for people to be able to use their superannuation for housing deposits, which economists universally say will do nothing but push up house prices. Do they have anything on the supply side? And are we likely to see something before the next election from the coalition on that?
Well, it's a yes and a yes, and I don't know anything further because they're keeping their powder dry on this front. One of the big questions, I think, and one of the things I'm writing about is Peter Dutton leaving it too late to actually bring Australian voters into his confidence on what he would do as Prime Minister if he ever got the chance. They're very slow to put any policy on the table, incredibly slow by comparison with, say, the Labor opposition 3 years ago. There's just so few policies on the table. Housing is an example. They've got super for housing. You can dip into your super to then use that towards the home deposit as a first home buyer. But as you said, Jack, that's a potential driver of the price. It doesn't actually increase the supply of housing. Now, that said, the coalition is working on some other housing measures.
Okay.
There will be a housing package with other ideas on supply, but nobody is briefing me on what those ideas are going to be just yet.
Yeah, I'm really keen to hear about that. We might try to get someone from the coalition on to talk about them when they do announce them. I want to throw forward now, obviously the government is trying to clear the decks of legislation and ready itself for the next election. So can I get your predictions, please, gentlemen? Are changes to negative gearing likely to be part of Labor's re-election platform? James?
At this point in time, I would say if they're not, Anthony Albanese will almost certainly be in a minority government scenario after the election. If they do it, I think there's an outside chance they could retain their majority. I think that will eventually dawn on enough people within Labor, and I think that they will take a carefully targeted and limited negative gearing tax change policy to the next election. I think if they're clever, they don't touch capital gains tax.
Okay, so just to get into that, you actually think that this could be the policy that gets them over the line from minority government to be able to govern in majority again?
I think housing is the single most important issue at the next election, and they are bleeding Labor. They are bleeding votes to the Greens on the left, and they are bleeding votes on the right to people who last time said, I don't like ScoMo, I'll give Albo a go, and now they're saying, those voters, I don't know who this guy is or what he stands for or what he's done in the last 3 years. He needs to pick a fight, and he needs to do it soon. As in the next 3 or 4 months by the end of the year, and say, this is what we stand for, this is what we fight for. And he hits those under 40s with something that they understand and say, he gets it. But it also hits those mums and dads who are maybe swing voters saying, how the heck are my kids ever going to get into a home?
David?
Yeah, I think on balance, Labor is likely to do something on negative gearing as part of a policy package at the next election. And that's because some of the signals that we've been hearing this week are, first of all, there's no denial that Treasury are working on this kind of modelling. And the signal from the Prime Minister is that he's concerned about housing supply, and he would need to be convinced that changes to negative gearing could improve housing supply. As part of a package, it seems to me quite clear that there could be adjustments to negative gearing, perhaps to fund some other measures on housing supply, as part of a broader plan that would actually increase the number of homes being built. It's about the full package, not just about this one totemic policy, but it certainly becomes a way to galvanise the debate, and nobody will be left wondering about whether Labor is doing something on housing as part of that broader package. I think the response from Adam Bandt would be to attack Labor for not wiping away $176 billion in tax breaks, and the attack from And the attack from Peter Dutton will be to pretend that Labor is wiping away $176 billion in tax breaks. So it would not be easy for Labor to hold the middle ground on that policy, but it does become a way to assure Australians they're acting on the housing crisis.
Yep. All right. Well, this is so exciting. I love it when we have a fight about tax policy on our hands, and hopefully we're gearing up for that. We have very long memories at this pod, so I will remember those two predictions, and you might get some sort of reward if they come true. Thank you very much for joining us, gentlemen. I'm talking
Thanks,
like,
Jackie.
I don't know, a packet of chocolate frogs or something, so don't get your hopes up.
I'll take it. Yeah, I like the ones with the strawberry.
Okay, noted.